Hello, this is your host Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today's episode 63 of the Casual Stream, The Failure of the Romanovs. So this has kind of been a long time coming. Obviously, in dissident circles, people are familiar with the OrthoBros, but also neo-reactionaries who fetishize autocracy as such. And both groups tend to have a fetish for the Romanov dynasty of the Russian Empire. And the argument usually goes like this. Well, if they were in charge, we wouldn't have this problem, even though at one point they were in charge, and we ended up with Lenin. So the obvious fatuousness of the argument should be self-evident to people, but it's not. And part of it is they look at the superficial characteristics of the Russian Empire, and they think that, well, we don't have those. So, but Russia at one point did. Not that it has them now or that it had them after Lenin took over. And it also kind of plays to this appeal to the strongman, this idea of a autocracy that could crush socialist dissent, even though it actually didn't. So, yeah. But here's the thing. What lessons can we learn from the Romanovs and the Russian experiment? Ultimately, what not to do. This is not anything that you want to replicate. And the tragedy of the 20th century with the rise of international communism, the Soviet Union, and the Cold War is all entirely the fault of the Romanovs. If they hadn't made a series of incredibly stupid blunders, there need never have been a revolution at all in Russia. Or at least not like that. You might have had a bourgeois revolution like you had in England and America, but you need not have had a Leninist Bolshevik one. So the first thing we need to set up is what is the Russian political system that the Romanovs then inherited. So beginning in so prior to the 13th century, Russia was converted to the Russian principalities. In the 10th century, were settled by Swedish Viking princes, and they then ruled over as sort of merchant raiders over the Slavic population. They converted to Orthodoxy beginning around 988, and then it sort of radiated out from Kiev. And from there until 1241, when the Mongols set up the Golden Horde and the Tatar yoke occupying Kiev and much of Russia, at the time, you had a patchwork of independent principalities, which had what we would call political development very similar to that of medieval Europe as a whole. You had strong parliamentary principles, a public assembly called the Vetch, which, in England, all of these institutions eventually led to a constitutional monarchy. But in Russia, they were destroyed, and I'll get to that in a little bit. And so they basically have elected princes, and this becomes a full-blown republic in Novgorod, which was never fully brought under the sphere of the Mongols. But these checks and balances, these more mercantile constitutional perspective of the Kievan Rus was stamped out by the Mongols. They correctly saw that these institutions represented a threat to their consolidation of power, and so they destroyed them. Of course, the Mongols themselves have the Great Khan, who rules as an autocrat in the Asiatic fashion, which puts Russia, the Muscovites who take over after the Mongols, firmly in votive hydraulic empire theory, the idea that Asia, in order to deal with riverine irrigation, developed large-scale imperial structures to coordinate these efforts. So eventually Muscovy overthrows the Golden Horde and the Tatar yoke under Ivan III. And what they then do is, in so doing, they've adopted essentially the same political outlook as the Mongols, a top-down authoritarian aristocracy. Now, they're not nomadic. They have basically a warrior caste, a military aristocracy with mounted soldiers called boyars. So it's similar to medieval knights. And so their entire reason for being is to expand territorially, to gain honor, to gain more land, and to show their prowess as warriors. And so in order to resist the Golden Horde, they then develop a similar political system to the Mongols. So in one sense, the Tatar yoke never ended because the original line of political development that Russia was on, which was in accordance with European precedents and norms, was just completely ended with the Mongol horde. And by the time the Mongols were driven out, Novgorod, the other independent state, which represented the traditional republican institutions of pre-Mongol Russia, was conquered by the Muscovites. And the entire population of Novgorod was moved to the province of Perm, which is in the far east of European Russia, just to the west of the Ural mountain range, in a sort of almost Assyrian-style population relocation. So by the time you get to the 15th century, Russia is basically an Oriental despotic autocracy. Ivan the Terrible rules through his secret police and with terror, the Okhrana. And so this has already been set up. So all the institutions of repression, the secret police, the military, the gendarme, the Soviet Union would later use, were already in place in Tsarist Russia. Also, as an absolute monarchy, an imperial system, there was no accountability. The Tsar was the highest political authority. There's no one above the Tsar. And the Tsar didn't have to listen to anyone. Now, ultimately, in the case of Nicholas II, reality catches up with you. You have to listen to people. The revolution made you listen. But until that point, you didn't really have to. They kept serfdom longer than any other European country because it served the interests of the warrior class and as well as the Tsar himself. And so they had this sort of one-dimensional attitude. If you have a hammer, every problem is a nail. It's very blinkered and short-sighted and really only instills anger and resentment against you. Now, this is just as a setting for the Russian political system. Now, the road to World War I, and by definition, the road to revolution, begins at the end of the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War. Initially, Russia was extremely successful and was able to force Turkey to make a series of concessions in the Treaty of San Stefano. But other European powers said that that would be too much. It would unbalance the balance of power in Europe. Turkey could not be allowed to fall so low. And so what ends up happening is in Berlin, Bismarck hosts a new conference where the other European powers basically threaten Russia and say, look, you can't do this. You got to give Turkey back more of its stuff, and you can't take all that for yourself. So what ends up happening is the Tsar, after that, the lesson learned was Germany stepped in to disrupt our Balkans expansionism. And that if we want to achieve our goals in the Balkans, which ultimately would consist in the reconquest of Istanbul, Constantinople from the Turks, and restore it to orthodoxy, we have to get rid of the German influence. Because the German influence, if they just sit on the sidelines, they can just step in and tell us what to do. That's sort of the lesson that was perceived to have been learned. We also see the state of Russia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries with the writings of Leo Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, which was a society marked by corruption, alcoholism, greed, vanity, and carelessness. And the people that lived at the bottom of society had an extremely difficult, hard existence. One that the people didn't really care about. Richard Peiss, in his Russia Before the Revolution, points out that even the Orthodox Church didn't really care all that much for the oppression of the peasants and the industrial workers. Something that he points out that in the West, both Protestant and Catholic churches were more vocal in these injustices and pointing them out, which in part led to Western reforms, which negated the need, which diffused any sort of Bolshevik-style revolution in the West. So you have basically the power being protected by the church, which is your propaganda arm, and the military, which is the bayonets that mow people down if they get in the way. So what did Russia do from this realization that they had to get rid of Germany? What needs to be stated is that the two alliances that developed to start World War I, which were involved in World War I, is firstly the Entente, which is the Allies, which initially was the Franco-Russian alliance. England enters the Entente, I think, in 1906. And then the Central Powers, which was initially just Germany and Austria, which had been allies since the end of the Prussian-Austrian War of 1866, which later included Bulgaria and Turkey. Now, as George Kennan points out in the Franco-Russian alliance, the Central Powers were a purely defensive alliance. There was no need. There was so if Austria went to war with Russia, and it was Austria that started the war, Germany was not obligated to come to Austria's defense. The Franco-Russian alliance was different. It obligated Russia to send troops in a war if France started it. And many of the Tsar's advisors at the time, such as Gere, said that was a terrible idea. You're basically letting France hold us hostage. So the first thing is there were the negotiators of the treaty were the Russian Obruchev and the Frenchman Boisdeffre. And I'm going to be reading from one of my previous articles on the Praise of Folly WordPress from like 2016. So this is a quotation from Kennan's book. And we read, and this is in the July 1892 meetings. And what he, Obruchev, then asked would then be the equivalent aims of the French. Boisdeffre's answer was instantaneous, the recovery of Alsace-Lorraine. Obruchev was suspicious. Would you not also, he asked, wish to extend your borders to the Rhine and break up Germany? One senses here the effects of Gere's warnings against Russia associating herself with any such far-reaching aims. Boisdeffre, in response to this sally, was evasive. One would first have to know what success one had on the battlefield. Let us begin by beating them. After it will be easy. Now, that's very telling. But then what does the Tsar think? Because then the Tsar at the time was Alexander III, a hardliner. In fact, the Russian monarch took a hard line after the assassination of Alexander II by radicals in the street. And this is what he says. He's talking to Geers, his personal advisor. And again, quoting, "We must correct the mistakes of the past and destroy Germany at the first possible moment. With Germany broken up, he agreed Austria would not dare to move." Geers, gathering his courage in the face of this unexpected statement, put the question, but what would we gain by helping the French destroy Germany? Why would indeed, replied the Tsar. What would we gain be that Germany as such would disappear? It would break up into a number of small, weak states the way it used to be. So we already have in the 1890s, between 1891 to 1994, Russia basically agreeing that their goal in this alliance was to break Germany up into small principalities the way it was before 1871. None of Germany's far-reaching war aims, even which led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where Russia had to cough up Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, was anywhere near as severe as that. And this was a decision made by the Tsar himself. And what's ridiculous is it was so petty, because if you read, again, Kennan's work, he was married to an heiress of Schleswig-Holstein in Denmark. And she had an axe to grind against the Germans because of the Schleswig-Holstein War of 1864. So, sort of being a cuck, he lets his wife sort of lean into his international political decisions. Also, he has his own political reasons for doing so. This is a colossally idiotic thing to do. First of all, because after the Crimean War, Russia was militarily, it was clear, the whole world, they were far behind the European powers, the other European powers, specifically France and Britain, in their military capabilities. And they never really caught up. Now, of course, Germany by this point had already trounced France. So Russia was no way up to snuff in order to defeat Germany at this time. And it wasn't actually at all. In Kennan's work as well, Geers says, well, look, if we go to war with Germany, this is going to destroy the Russian state and will reinforce German nationalism, the opposite of what Tsar Alexander III wanted. Very prescient statements. So, and again, Tsar Alexander didn't have to listen to his advisors. He's an absolute monarch by the grace of God with no authority above him other than God. So he can just do whatever the heck he wants and plunge Europe into a war without any consequences of thought of it. So, and then we have, of course, Russia entering in the Russo-Japanese War, where they thought would be, see, because part of the problem is because Russia is an autocracy, because Russia is a military aristocracy, in order to win national prestige, in order to prop up the regime at home, it's compelled to acquire military successes, right? Its bag of tricks is limited. It can't do other things in order to improve its standing at home. It's falling behind Europe in industrialization. It's falling behind in the rights and liberties Europeans expect, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all of these things. So it's making up for that by starting wars that it can't win. Classic mistake that autocrats make. Charles I did that as well, leading to the English Civil War. So then they then lose the Russo-Japanese War, which in part leads to the First Revolution of 1905. Now, the real spark for that First Revolution is what's called Bloody Sunday, where Father Gapon led a march. He's an Orthodox priest, in order to get the Tsar's attention that, hey, your people are suffering. It's really bad. You need to pay attention to the situation of the industrial workers. He was very pro-Tsar himself, sympathetic to the Tsar, considered the Tsar the father of the Russian people, and that he just didn't know better, right? So this is basically a peaceful protest from within the accepted order, right? He's an Orthodox priest. He's doing everything by the book. And what's the response? The army comes out and shoots the protesters, and he has to go into hiding. This is so important, right? Because what Bloody Sunday shows in the Petrograd Massacre is that there is no reforming the Tsar system through peaceful means. You could be completely within the accepted channels. You don't have freedom of assembly. You don't have freedom of speech. You don't have any of the freedoms that other Europeans would take for granted. And you can come with the most benign intentions and just get mowed down. This then led to the outbreak of the 1905 revolution, which was subsequently crushed. And the internal security minister was so effective at what he did, Stolypin, and he hanged all of the revolutionary leadership that he caught. They were called Stolypin neckties. So many people were hung. Which, again, it was successful in the short term, right? Because it brought the end of that revolution, but it sowed the seeds for 1917. Now, if Russia had just stopped military expansionism there wouldn't have been a revolution. Because the key thing here is that in 1917, the entire army mutinied in the Navy. So the entire military mutinied, right? So you have all these angry workers and peasants who've now trained how to be soldiers who then mutiny and turn their guns on you. Well, that hadn't happened in 1905, and it wasn't likely going to happen if Russia didn't go to war. So, but Russia's still smarting from its defeat against Japan, and they still have the secret treaty with France. So, we can argue, pros and cons of German policy that let that happen, but again, according to Kennan, Germany wasn't unduly provocative. It was worse negligent in keeping tabs on Russian diplomacy. But in 1905, with the Willy-Niki letters, Wilhelm of Germany met with Nicholas at Bjorko, an island off the coast of Finland, to sign a treaty of peace and friendship, which, as soon as the Russian military apparatus heard about, scrapped it, saying, we have a treaty with France. We have to go to war with Germany. Remember, after losing to Japan, it's literally the most brain damaged thing you can do. We lost to the Japanese, who heretofore we thought were just backward Asiatics. So now we're going to fight Germany and Austria. They knew those two would go to war, and then eventually Turkey. So the Russians, they can't help themselves. They just double down. And Nicholas, being the weak-willed man that he was, went along with it. I mean, he's the Tsar after all. He could just tell him to pound salt and do something else. But, forces were set in motion by Alexander III that could not easily be changed. And ultimately, the commitment to go to war in 1914 was fundamentally the worst decision that the Romanovs ever made, because not only did it lead to their defeat, the end of the Russian Empire and the rise of the revolution, but also led to the rise of communism and the untold millions that the communists killed, and the Cold War. All of this could have been avoided had the Romanovs not royally screwed up. See, because ultimately they had to transition from an agrarian peasant medieval society to a modern industrial urban one. And that process of transition is very difficult. And the goal for any political system is to thread that needle to avoid a revolution. Because if all of the gains go straight to the top and the workers and peasants are just ground into the dirt, they're going to revolt. Now, in England, you had, the Chartists in the 1840s who were, I guess, quasi-socialist reformers, revolutionaries. But ultimately, what England had was freedom of speech, freedom of the press, an aristocracy, and a leadership that was willing to listen to the concerns of subjects so that they made concessions, reforms that eventually would cut off any broader socialist revolutionary policy. Now we have the Russian war itself, right? The war itself was a complete disaster for the Russians. They literally had no idea what they were doing. They didn't have enough ammunition for the soldiers. They eventually didn't have enough food for the country. And so the leadership of the Russian military was, again, the boyars, this military aristocracy, which had long since moved away from the more visceral realities of a medieval life. These were not people that were, jousting and tilting at tournaments like their medieval ancestors. These were decadent aesthetes who were living off their estates. Again, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky write extensively about these people and just how disconnected they were, living off the sweat and toil of the serfs. And so what ends up happening is they have no military training at all. Compare that to the Germans, who are elite graduates from the military academies of Germany. They're just so far better qualified than the Russians. At the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, the Russians didn't use coded messages, so the Germans could just tune into Russian radio traffic and get troop movements. I mean, this is ridiculous. Who does this? Well, the Russians do, apparently. And so in 1915, against the recommendation of Grand Duke Nicholas, who was then commander-in-chief of Russia, Nicholas, who always had to be the center of attention, decided he was going to appoint himself as commander-in-chief of the Russian military. Now, Grand Duke Nicholas objected to this on the very sound grounds that any military defeats would now be squarely blamed on the Tsar. Right? If it's some officer or official that the Tsar has appointed, any defeat, the Tsar could deflect and say, well, it's not really my responsibility. This man failed in his duties. And then the Tsar could have plausible deniability and then, appoint someone else. But by putting himself squarely in charge, he made himself squarely responsible, which in part ended up losing the support of the soldiers, who would later mutiny in February of 1917. And again, just for a brief summary of the Western Front, in the opening days in 1914, Russia completely failed in its attack on Germany. And its attack on Austria, which initially was successful, was rolled back. In 1915, Germany drives Russia out of most of Poland. 1916, there's another attack on Austria, which the Germans helped plug up. Romania joins the war and is basically taken out in a blitzkrieg. And then in 1917, the Germans launch a major offensive, which takes over large swaths of Russian territory, utilizing the innovative stormtrooper tactics by Hütter. And at no point do the Russians ever score any significant victories against the Germans. The Austrians and the Turks, they score some, but they're never really fully able to exploit those victories. And all of this leads to a military that is extremely disgruntled and frustrated. And then, of course, there's starvation at home. And the February 1917 revolution begins with bread riots. So, again, just one catastrophic decision after another. And, of course, again, it's the Tsar. There's nobody above him. He can do whatever he wants. And, whether you might say, well, Nicholas was a weak man. Well, Alexander III was a hard man. And yet he set in motion the war with Germany that would lead to the dissolution of the Russian Empire against the advice of his own advisors. So I don't think the situation would have been a whole lot different with a, quote, hard ruler. If anything, they still would have lost the war. That wasn't going to change the outcome of the war. The only difference would be, would they have fought longer and the Germans just took over completely, or would a revolution have taken place? That's the only real question here. The other thing is, the Russian nobility and aristocracy had kind of hermetically sealed them off from society. They were living in a complete fantasy land. Nicholas himself was considered unusually short for a Romanov. The average height of a Romanov man was from 6'2" to 6'6". So through generations of selective breeding, they were basically giants. And this was the most beautiful, the most wealthy, the most cultured people in society, all living this sort of like, fairy tale, all at the expense of everybody else in Russia. And they just refused to see it, right? Right up until the revolution, the Tsarina was still planning for balls and parties. There's massive defeats on the front. There's starvation in Petrograd. There's revolution afoot. And they're still talking about parties. This is literally insane. I mean, when the revolution shows up at their doorstep, they're caught by surprise. And you're like, how can they be surprised, right? How could they have not seen this coming? They were just living so much in their own fantasy land that they built around themselves. The wealth that they had acquired gave them power, but it also became their prison because they could curate their life in such a way that they didn't have to pay attention to anything going around them. And because of that, and because of the absolute power of the system, they didn't have to listen to prudent advisors who said, hey, this is a bad idea, you probably shouldn't do it. Unlike in, say, Western countries, where you have just distributed power centers. Now, if we look at the crisis of February and October of 1917, these revolutions can be laid squarely at the feet of the Tsar, primarily due to his inability to concede power to the Duma. Almost all the other European nations at this time had parliaments, and the monarch had ceded some of his authority to these parliaments. Now, in the case of England and France, that was due to the defeat of the monarchy, right? Cromwell defeats the royalists. And then when they come back after Cromwell's dead, they then get overthrown again by William of Orange in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And eventually they're forced to sign away their power to Parliament. And the French was a bloody revolution too. But other European countries got by without that. And so by 1917, the things that we would consider basic rights were still challenges, right? But only in Russia did you have maybe the Ottoman Empire as well, such a severe autocracy in which the most basic of these rights was not acknowledged. And one man could only hold off. See, here's the thing, right? With the rising merchant industrial class, this was the class of people that would develop Russia economically such that it could be a military threat to its neighbors in a way that it just wasn't due to its backwardness and underdevelopment compared to Germany, compared to Britain and France. And so those are the people you could least afford to upset. But of course, those are the people that were also clamoring for political representation, given their increasing influence in society. And the Tsar's fantasy that they could still live in this medieval time capsule and pretend the Industrial Revolution wasn't happening was just insane. How could it have gone any other way? We already have the English Civil War. We already have the French Revolution. The Tsar should have seen the cost of not ceding power to the Duma. Because the people that really had the power weren't actually the aristocrats anymore. And then to top it all off, he then raised an army, equipped it, and then radicalized it by bungling the military leadership of World War I itself. And then, creating conditions which led to starvation at home, where they were concerned about their wives and children. And so, again, if the Tsar had just made sensible concessions to the Duma, this likely could have been avoided. And if he'd avoided the First World War, this likely could have been avoided. And of course, he didn't. So what are the consequences then? Well, obviously the consequences are first, the February Revolution, which is mostly bloodless, and then Kerensky takes power in the provisional government. Kerensky continues fighting the war, which was a disastrous decision. He should have ended the war. Lenin said that the regime that makes peace with Germany first is the regime that will last in Russia. Very prescient words. So as soon as he takes power, he ends the war with Germany, and on very unfavorable grounds to Russia, but he knew that in order to consolidate power, he'd have to do that. Now, I've already talked a lot on this channel about Sutton and how the Bolsheviks were actually a coup. We know they had German support, obviously, because they wanted London to pull out of the fight, but they also had support from the United States and Canada and Britain with financial interests, specifically that dodgy incident with Trotsky outside of Halifax. So that's a bit of a coup, and you could argue, well, could Nicholas have really foreseen that? No, but that's the point. Once you go down this road to oblivion, where either Germany or Russia is going to be destroyed, as Gears predicted, you've just unleashed Pandora's box. You have no idea what's going to happen next. Now, the other thing too is Russia's direct involvement and responsibility for World War I. I'm going to read a brief citation from Luigi Albertini's The Origins of the War of 1914, where he discusses what goes on with the Black Hand. So the Black Hand is a secret society in Serbia, which is plotting to undermine the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to bring the South Slavs into revolution under the aegis of Serbia. And their head is also the head of Serbian military intelligence, a guy named Dmitrievich. Now, according to Luigi Albertini, who interviewed several key Serbian generals and officers, he says this: some of his comrades maintain that the motive of Dragutin Dmitrievich's decision was the fear that the Austrian maneuvers in Bosnia might be cover for making war on Serbia. But they forget that he was head of a military intelligence of the general staff and must have perfectly well known that Austria at the moment was not preparing for war with Serbia. It is unthinkable he should have been so irresponsible as to take up a suggestion emanating from Bosnian emigres, still less take it up with the idea that it could not possibly be carried out. He was not a man to prearrange outrages with the thought that they would fail, nor to accept passively other people's suggestions and follow them out. It was always he who took the decisions after pondering on the means, the aims, the consequences, and the scope of his actions. Had a clear vision of things. He was one to guide, not to be guided, and dragged along in the wake. I am convinced that the initiative and the outrage against the Archduke was his. Okay, so this is from Dmitrievich's nephew. But then we have his account with Romanov. Okay, this is from Simic, an interviewed from a newspaper entry in 1925 of Clarté in Paris. Apis, the code name for Dmitrievich, worked daily in association with the Russian military attaché Artamonov. From Artamonov, he learned of the decisions taken at Konopskich meeting. These decisions are perfectly comprehensible if one considers the state of the Slav element in Austro-Hungarian provinces, which steadily assumed greater proportions as a result of the Serbian victories. From Artamonov, he learned that Archduke Francis Ferdinand was to attend the big maneuvers in Bosnia, and which were to take place in the summer of 1914. In Dmitrievich's eyes, Francis Ferdinand was the man who had turned us out of Albania, Durazzo, and Scutari, who wanted to tear up the Treaty of Bucharest. By his murder, Dmitrievich hoped to sow confusion, also in the Austro-German military camarilla, and delay the latent world war for which we were unprepared. He saw the interruption of Austrian war preparations because of fresh hostilities arising from its murder. This might rouse the Slavs and the monarchy to revolt. When he had become practically unavoidable, Apis thought it his duty, before taking decisive action, to come to an understanding with Artamonov. He informed him of the preparations for the Sarajevo outrage. A few days later, Artamonov gave his reply, which ran, "Just go ahead. If you are attacked, you will not stand alone." Artamonov had sought exact instructions from his superiors. Who were they? Very probably Hartwig. Hartwig knew everything according to Apis' firm belief. Probably St. Petersburg, too, where Hartwig had personal friends. What about Sazonov? We cannot say with certainty, since the policy of ambassadors often differed in many details from that of ministers. Artamonov was well aware of the activities of the Black Hand. He personally paid Apis 8,000 francs for propaganda in Austria. Now, Luigi Albertini later interviews Artamonov and Artamonov says, I didn't say any of those things. This was false. But he has this to say about Artamonov's character. The present writer must honestly say he remained unconvinced by the behavior of this officer, who struck him as being of limited intelligence with a limited strength of character, or by his explanations for his absence from Belgrade even after the outrage. So what we have here is the smoking gun that Russian military intelligence from probably some cabal within the highest levels of Russian military planning supported the hit on the Archduke, which would start the First World War. And it stands to reason, right? Serbia is a mouse against Austria-Hungary. Why would Serbia do such a provocative thing without assurances? It wouldn't, right? It wouldn't. And so the other thing needs to be pointed out is, why was Austria-Hungary targeted? Why was rather Franz Ferdinand targeted? Well, one of the statements that the assassins gave was that this was reformist heir, right? He was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, but he was reformist, right? As long as the Serbs could provoke South Slav animosity against Austria, they had a hope of rallying them to their cause for Greater Serbia. But one of the ways that Austria-Hungary was planning to forestall this was the Archduke was in the process of, quote, federalizing Austria. There was a goal called the Greater United States of Austria, where, taking cues from the United States and Switzerland, they were going to federalize the country and give all adult males suffrage, which, had that happened, the Serbian nationalists realized would be the end of any Greater Serbia. You don't hear that in the history books, but that's what history says if you care to look. So it's ironic, right, that Austria was actually pivoting towards a more westerly orientation, whereas Russia was still fighting that, but it was too late because elements within Serbia targeted him and killed him, which then started the war, which Austria subsequently lost. But again, this is consistent with Russia's Balkan strategy, right? They've had a Balkan strategy throughout the 19th and, up into the early 20th century. And one of the things here is, again, Russia's a one-trick pony. They have to gain prestige by military conquest. They have to expand in all directions. Now, you could plausibly say after the Mongol conquest that, well, there's no defensible boundaries. Russia needs buffers. All right, fair enough, But, moving into the Balkans and trying to take Constantinople is more than just making a buffer zone. And it was these Balkans conflicts back in 1877-78 and Germany's interposition against Russian gains, which led them to the alliance with France and the road to war. And it's not that these decisions, well, also during the war itself, Rasputin, who was one of the Tsar Nicholas's key advisors, who had a direct access to the Tsarina, recommended that Russia withdraw from the war, that if they kept fighting the Germans, they'd lose. So it's not like the Tsars have bad advisors. I mean, some of them are bad, of course, but Alexander III had advisors who warned him against the war with Germany. Nicholas had advisors who warned him against the war of Germany. And they just didn't listen. And they didn't have to listen because they had absolute political power and they could do whatever they wanted, which basically meant running their country into the ground and then creating a crisis situation which would allow for the rise of Lenin and the Soviet Union and all the attendant consequences throughout the 20th century. So if Russia is an example of anything, specifically the last 30 to 40 years of the Romanov dynasty, it's what not to do. You have a completely out-of-touch, delusional ruling class surrounded by wealth, living in the lap of luxury, not paying attention to what's going on in the world, thinking they can freeze the world in the Middle Ages and still live like... Well, it's not even the Middle Ages, though, because medieval Russia had parliaments, right? That's the joke. And some sort of weird Asiatic despotism. And so it just blew up. Because ultimately, as, in Brave New World, Aldous Huxley says, or in his interview about Brave New World with Mike Wallace, Aldous Huxley says you can do anything with a bayonet except sit on it. And that's a lesson the Tsars didn't learn. They couldn't sit on their bayonet. And yeah, it's just this idea that the right has anything to learn from the Romanovs and the Tsar and this whole OrthoBro neo-reactionary angle is just delusional and fatuous. And it's just going to set up anybody that follows that for the same kind of failure. So, yeah, that's sort of tonight's show. We have in the chat Cyber Ninja Zero, Arvin Jindal, GF, and JLM. Hello. So yeah, I guess that's all for tonight, guys. Make sure to tune in Saturday for the roundtable, where we're going to discuss the Hamas-Israel conflict. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.